In the fall of 1964, inside a small martial arts studio in Oakland, California, two men stood only a few feet apart, and neither of them fully understood what was about to happen. One of them was 24 years old, unusually confident, and already used to being challenged by people who thought he talked too much for someone so young. His name was Bruce Lee. The other man, Wong Jack Man, had spent years training inside a tradition that Bruce had quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, begun to question in public. There were no cameras in that room. There was no audience beyond a handful of witnesses, and even they would spend the rest of their lives disagreeing about almost everything they claimed to remember. What happened in the next few minutes would not simply decide who won a private fight between two martial artists in a nearly empty room. It would force one of them to confront the limits of everything he believed he had already mastered. And it would quietly set in motion the transformation that eventually created the Bruce Lee the world would come to know, the one on movie posters, the one quoted in gyms and locker rooms decades after his death, the one whose name became shorthand for martial arts itself. At the time, nobody standing in that room could have imagined that people would still be arguing about what really happened there more than 60 years later. Not because the outcome mattered so much on its own, but because of what that outcome did to the man who walked out of it. This is the story of the fight that turned Bruce Lee into a legend. Not simply because he won it. Because of the question it left behind, a question he could not put down for the rest of his life. By 1964, Bruce Lee was not yet the man the world would later mythologize. He was not the icon from Enter the Dragon, not the philosopher quoted on posters, not the martial arts figure whose image would eventually outlive nearly every actor of his generation. He was a 24-year-old immigrant trying to build something in a country that had not yet decided what to make of him. He had left Hong Kong only a few years earlier, arriving in the United States with considerably more ambition than money. In Seattle, he opened a small school and began teaching a version of Wing Chun he was still actively reshaping in his own head, testing ideas against students who were willing to be his laboratory. By the time he relocated his operation south to Oakland, he already had a reputation, though not the kind history would eventually attach to his name. He was known, in certain circles, as fast, as disciplined, as remarkably talented for someone still in his early 20s. And, depending on who you asked, as someone who talked about his own ability with a confidence that some considered earned and others considered arrogant. The world would eventually know him as an icon. In late 1964, he was simply a young instructor with strong opinions, trying to prove that those opinions were worth something. He trained obsessively, often for hours a day, treating his own body less like a fixed instrument and more like an experiment still in progress. He read widely outside martial arts entirely, pulling ideas from psychology, philosophy, and Western boxing, then testing whether any of it survived contact with a real sparring partner. Most of his peers, by contrast, treated their style as something finished, something to be preserved rather than questioned. Bruce treated his as something unfinished, something he was still actively building in front of the very people who expected him to simply repeat what he had been taught. That gap between how Bruce approached his craft and how much of his surrounding community approached theirs was not loud at first. It showed up in small disagreements, in raised eyebrows during demonstrations, in comments passed quietly between more senior instructors who were not used to being challenged by someone so young. But small disagreements, left unresolved long enough, tend to eventually demand a resolution neither side can avoid. That confidence, more than anything else, would soon put him on a collision course with an entire community. Bruce did not see martial arts the way many of his contemporaries did. Where a large number of traditional schools emphasized fixed forms, memorized sequences, and techniques preserved mostly because they had always been taught that way, Bruce was pulled towards something closer to function over form. He wanted efficiency. He wanted speed. He wanted movement that could survive contact with an unpredictable opponent, not simply repetition performed well enough to satisfy a teacher. To Bruce, a technique that could not hold up under real pressure did not deserve protection just because it was old. That idea alone was enough to make some traditionalists uneasy. Martial arts in Chinese communities across America at the time carried weight beyond combat. Styles were tied to lineage, to teachers, to decades of inherited authority. Suggesting that some of it might be outdated was not just a technical opinion. To certain ears, it sounded like disrespect. What made the tension sharper was not only what Bruce believed, but who he was willing to teach it to. In Oakland, he had begun instructing students from a range of backgrounds, including students who were not Chinese. For a portion of the traditional martial arts community, that decision touched something more sensitive than technique. Kung Fu, in many of these circles, was treated as something to be protected, not distributed freely to outsiders. Bruce, for his part, did not appear especially interested in asking permission. He believed his approach worked. He was young enough, and sure enough of himself, to say so in public, sometimes bluntly, sometimes in ways that word of mouth could easily sharpen into something closer to an insult by the time it reached the wrong ears. There was also a generational element to the friction that is easy to miss from a distance of 60 years. Many of the established teachers Bruce found himself at odds with had spent decades earning their standing within a tightly guarded hierarchy, one where authority was measured in years of loyalty as much as in raw skill. Bruce had none of that patience, and made little effort to disguise it. He was not interested in waiting his turn inside a system he already suspected was holding people back. To some observers, that made him refreshing. To others, it made him something closer to a threat. It would not take long for that confidence to draw a direct and formal challenge, one that would not stay theoretical for much longer. If stories like this one make you appreciate how much history sits behind the legends we think we already know, this channel exists for exactly that. Consider subscribing, because there is more of Bruce Lee's real story still ahead, and it is far stranger than the version most people have heard. Exactly how the confrontation came to be arranged depends heavily on who is telling the story, and that disagreement starts almost from the very beginning. One widely circulated version holds that a group connected to the local Chinese martial arts community in San Francisco sent Bruce something close to an ultimatum: stop teaching non-Chinese students, or accept a formal challenge to prove his methods worked against a representative of the traditional schools. In this telling, Wong Jack Man was selected, or agreed, to be that representative, arriving from San Francisco specifically to settle the matter on behalf of a broader community that felt Bruce had crossed a line. Wong Jack Man's own account, given decades later in interviews and legal filings, described something different. In his version, the confrontation had less to do with ethnicity and considerably more to do with Bruce's public claims about his own superiority as a martial artist, claims Wong felt could not go unanswered without damaging the credibility of the traditional styles Bruce had criticized. In this telling, Wong was not enforcing a boundary around who could learn Kung Fu. He was defending a discipline he had spent most of his life mastering, against a younger man he believed was too quick to dismiss it. Neither man left behind a single, agreed-upon account of how the challenge came together, who issued it first, or what exactly was promised to whom. What both versions agree on, at least, is the outcome of that disagreement. By late 1964, whatever had started as tension over teaching, tradition, and public pride was no longer something that could be settled with words. Something would have to happen in person, without an audience, and without any official record beyond the memories of the small number of people who chose to be there. It would be easy, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, to reduce Wong Jack Man to a footnote, the man Bruce Lee reportedly defeated on his way toward becoming a legend. That framing does him a disservice, and it flattens a story that is more complicated, and more interesting, than a simple hero and obstacle narrative. Wong Jack Man was, by most accounts, a serious and highly trained martial artist in his own right, schooled in northern Shaolin styles and respected within his own circles well before Bruce Lee's name meant anything outside a handful of schools on the West Coast. He had not simply wandered into a fight he was unprepared for. He had spent years building the very kind of expertise Bruce's public comments seemed to dismiss. In his own telling, Wong was not defending pride for its own sake. He was defending a way of understanding martial arts that had existed, and held value, long before Bruce Lee arrived in Oakland, one he believed deserved more respect than Bruce seemed willing to grant it in public. Seen this way, the fight was never really a story of hero versus villain, no matter how convenient that framing might be for a documentary. It was a story of two different philosophies, each convinced it was right, meeting in a small room because there was no longer any other way to settle the disagreement between them. The exact date is disputed, placed by different sources anywhere within a narrow window near the end of 1964, but most accounts agree it happened inside the studio Bruce operated in Oakland. There was no promotion. There was no belt on the line, no prize beyond the outcome itself. There was, by design, almost no audience, a small number of people connected to either Bruce or Wong, present largely to witness rather than to spectate. There is no footage of what happened inside that room. There is no transcript, no scorecard, no neutral third party whose account everyone accepted without dispute. What exists instead is a handful of competing memories, shaped over decades by loyalty, by reputation, and by the simple, unavoidable erosion that time does to every story it touches. What can be said with more confidence is this. Two men who had built meaningful parts of their identity around martial arts skill were about to test those identities directly against one another, with almost nothing standing between them and the answer. This is where the story becomes difficult, because there is no single version everyone agrees on, and pretending otherwise would not be honest. According to Bruce's own later accounts, and those closest to him, the fight was fast and decisive. In this version, Bruce closed the distance quickly, overwhelmed Wong with speed and relentless aggression, and brought the confrontation to an end within a very short window of time, commonly described as under a few minutes, though even that figure shifts slightly depending on who is repeating it. Wong Jack Man's account, given publicly years later, described something noticeably different, a longer struggle, closer to 20 minutes by his own recollection, in which he characterized himself as retreating strategically rather than being overwhelmed, and claimed that he ultimately chose to end the fight himself, out of a certain respect for Bruce, rather than being forced to stop through defeat. Witnesses aligned with Bruce described a fight that left little doubt about who had won. Witnesses closer to Wong remembered something murkier, a confrontation that ended without either man being decisively broken. No surviving account from either side is fully neutral, and none of them come without a personal stake in how the story would eventually be remembered by the people who told it. What most sources do agree on is that Bruce Lee was not knocked out and was not seriously injured. Beyond that single point of agreement, the specifics dissolve into competing memory, and the absence of any recording means no one alive today can simply settle the matter by watching a tape. Even the ending is contested. Some accounts describe Wong Jack Man attempting to flee toward the door before the fight was called, a detail Wong himself has firmly denied throughout his life. Other accounts insist there was no attempt to run at all, only a mutual, almost anticlimactic stop once both men recognized the confrontation had made its point. 60 years on, there is still no way to know for certain which of these competing memories, if either, is closer to what actually took place inside that room. If the story ended there, with a disputed private fight and no consensus on what actually happened, it would likely be a footnote, interesting mostly to martial arts historians, and largely forgotten by everyone else. What makes it matter, what turned it into something worth telling more than 60 years later, is what came after. By several accounts, including some attributed to Bruce himself in later interviews, he came away from the fight troubled. Not by the outcome, which by his own telling favored him clearly enough. He was troubled by how difficult it had been to end things as quickly and as cleanly as his own philosophy said it should have gone. He reportedly found himself more winded than he expected to be. He reportedly felt that the fight had taken longer, and demanded more effort, than a fight fought correctly ever should. That detail, more than the disputed timeline or the disputed duration, appears in different forms across multiple second-hand accounts, an outcome that satisfied Bruce noticeably less than a clean, effortless victory should have. He had walked into that room believing he already understood how a real fight was supposed to unfold, start to finish. He walked out of it carrying a set of questions he had not expected to be asking himself at all. There is something almost uncomfortable about that image, precisely because it does not match the version of Bruce Lee most people carry in their heads. The popular memory is of a man who never doubted himself, who moved through every confrontation with total certainty. The more honest version, the one closer to what actually seems to have happened in late 1964, is of a young man who won, and who still could not shake the feeling that winning was not supposed to feel like that. It is easy, decades later, to look at the finished legend and assume the doubt was never really there. But if the doubt had not been there, there would have been nothing left to change. In the months and years that followed, Bruce began more openly questioning the rigid structures he had already been suspicious of across traditional martial arts, not only in other people's schools, but eventually inside the very system he had been teaching under his own name. He started experimenting more aggressively with movement that stripped away anything not directly useful in a real confrontation. He drew ideas from Western boxing footwork, from fencing distancing and timing, from other combat disciplines entirely outside the traditional kung fu framework he had grown up inside, searching less for what tradition said should work and more for what actually held up when tested. It would not be historically accurate to claim that the philosophy later known as Jeet Kune Do was born the day after the fight in Oakland, fully formed and ready to be named. Bruce continued developing these ideas gradually, over years, refining them through his own teaching, his own training, and his continued willingness to discard anything that failed to hold up under real pressure. The Oakland fight did not hand him a finished philosophy. It handed him a reason to keep questioning the one he already had. Multiple people close to Bruce, along with several biographers who studied this period of his life closely, have pointed to the fight as a turning point rather than the sole cause of what came next. Not the single event that created Jeet Kune Do, but the experience that took an abstract dissatisfaction with rigid tradition and made it personal, specific, and impossible to simply set aside. Years later, millions of people around the world would recognize Bruce Lee's name instantly, would know his face from a poster before they knew a single fact about his life. On that particular night in Oakland, none of that existed yet. He was simply a 24-year-old martial artist standing in a small room, trying to prove that his ideas worked, with no way of knowing that the fight itself would matter far less, in the long run, than the questions it left behind. From that period forward, Bruce's trajectory shifted in ways that would eventually reach far beyond Oakland. He continued refining his approach to martial arts, gradually formalizing many of these ideas under the name Jeet Kune Do, a system built explicitly around adaptability rather than fixed forms, a direct extension of the questions that Private Fight had left him holding. His growing reputation as an instructor opened doors that had nothing to do with martial arts tournaments. Supporting roles on American television introduced him to wider audiences who had never seen movement like his before. Later, the films that eventually made him a global icon brought a style of on-screen martial arts choreography audiences in the West had simply never encountered, grounded in speed and economy of movement rather than the more theatrical styles Bruce had spent years quietly questioning, first in conversation, and then, that night in Oakland, in person. By the time of his death in 1973, Bruce Lee was no longer the 24-year-old instructor who had once needed to prove himself in a nearly empty room in front of a handful of witnesses. He had become one of the most influential figures in the history of both martial arts and global cinema, a status that, remarkably, would only continue to grow in the decades after he was gone. Schools around the world now teach concepts he helped popularize, often without ever mentioning his name directly. Mixed martial arts, a discipline that would not exist in its modern form for another 2 decades after his death, is frequently described by historians as owing a philosophical debt to exactly the kind of cross-discipline thinking Bruce began pushing for in the years right after Oakland, the idea that a fighter should draw from whatever actually works, regardless of which tradition it originally came from, rather than staying loyal to a single closed system out of habit or obligation. It is a strange kind of legacy. The man is gone. The specific fight that helped shape his thinking remains disputed, unrecorded, and unresolved. And yet the underlying idea he took from it, that no system, however respected, should be treated as finished, quietly reshaped an entire field long after the people who witnessed that night in Oakland had stopped being asked to retell it. None of that later trajectory erases what happened in 1964. If anything, it depends on it. The fight with Wong Jack Man did not create Bruce Lee's legend by itself, and it certainly did not hand him an instant, ready-made philosophy the moment it ended. What it did was force a supremely confident 24-year-old to sit with an uncomfortable question he had not planned on asking: if his system had not worked as effortlessly as he believed it should, what exactly needed to change, and was he actually willing to change it? Do you think Bruce Lee's greatest achievement was defeating the opponent standing in front of him, or was it his willingness to keep questioning the very system he had been trained, and had chosen, to follow? Tell us which one you believe in the comments. He entered that room wanting to prove that he was right. He left it with a reason to keep evolving, a distinction that, over the following decade, would separate him from countless other talented martial artists of his era who never felt compelled to ask that same question of themselves. That, more than any single punch, more than any disputed timeline, more than any version of the story that different witnesses swore was the true one, may be the real story behind the fight that turned Bruce Lee into a legend. Not a young man who simply won a private confrontation nobody filmed. A young man who was willing to keep questioning himself, long after he had already proven, at least to his own satisfaction, that he could.